Harvey to turn on my mic. There he is. Wow. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I know my name is Sil Millette, by the way. Right? I do appreciate that our church does have so many men that are ready, willing, and able to teach, because I've taught at Arlington Baptist a couple times. I was sick last week, so it's nice to be able to do that and know that you have some kind of backup. So I do appreciate everyone who's filled in for me. Brother Bob did an excellent job last week. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Jose, will you open us up in prayer? Amen. Thank you. Okay, so it has been a few weeks since we last studied Matthew, at least 2 weeks. So we'll do a quick recap and try to remember where we were. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions during the recap and see if you guys remember where we were, because I remember. So we saw that the Sanhedrin had delivered Jesus to the Roman governor Pilate. Can anyone remember why they gave Jesus up to Pilate? Why they didn't just condemn him to death themselves? They can't. Exactly. The Jews were not allowed to. And the other reason, that's the legal reason. The spiritual reason, does anyone remember the spiritual reason? Has to do with prophecy in the Psalms. He was sinless. Curses the man who hangs on a tree. That's the answer I was looking for. Jesus had to die on a tree. He had to hang on an upright piece of wood to be cursed, because he was sinless. There was no other way for him to receive a curse. And was Pilate comfortable with condemning Jesus to crucifixion? No, he was not. Why not? He found no fault in him. And do you remember what Matthew tells us about the reason the Jews were delivering him up that Pilate was aware of? Yeah, for envy. They were jealous of him, his following. And so the way I put it a few weeks ago was they were jealous of his favor with God and his favor with the people. God was blessing him. He was doing mighty things. And the people followed him. I mean, we know multitudes followed him. Now, Pilate had a tradition at Passover. Does anyone remember what that tradition was? To free one prisoner. And so he wants to avoid convicting this innocent man that's before him. He knows Jesus is innocent, but he also knows that the Sanhedrin has accused Jesus of crimes against Caesar. So if Pilate doesn't do anything about it, they're going to go tattle. They're going to send an emissary to Caesar and say, hey, your guy down there in Judah, not doing his job. He let a man go that was against the Roman government. Which you remember, nowhere do we see Jesus preach a political sermon other than when they ask him about should we pay taxes to Caesar, and he says yes. And that's one of the things the Jews accuse him of, right, is telling people not to pay their taxes, which is completely false. So he asks the people, which of these two men do you want freed? This Jesus, or do you want Barabbas freed? And as he's doing this, his wife sends a message to him. Does anyone remember what her message was? Don't have anything to do with this guy. I had a dream. I'm troubled about it. And don't have anything to do with Jesus. And yet, Pilate just ignores her. It's almost just like a side note in the Bible because nothing comes of it, other than we know that somehow God was giving Pilate a chance. Even though Jesus had to die on the cross, God knew, because God is omniscient, that Pilate would condemn him. It confirms that Pilate is doing wrong. It lets us know that, just like Jesus said at the Last Supper about Judas, these things have to happen, but woe to the man that makes them happen. Because that's a question of the heart. Judas' heart was wrong when he betrayed Jesus. Even though he did something according to God's plan, his heart about it was wrong. In the same way, Pilate is just following through with God's plan for salvation, but his heart is wrong. He's taking an innocent man and convicting him. So Pilate ignores her, and again he asks the crowd whether they want Jesus or this murdering insurrectionist Barabbas freed. And because they're under the influence of the Sanhedrin, who's been going around there are so many members of the Sanhedrin, and they're going throughout the crowd, basically telling people, call for Jesus' crucifixion. So when Pilate asks them who they want, who do they cry out for? Barabbas. And then he asks them what he should do with Jesus, and what's their response? Crucify him. Let him be crucified. And so that's where we are in the story now, is the people screaming out, let him be crucified. These same people who less than a week ago were saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who cometh in the name of the Lord. Basically calling him Messiah. So we're going to go ahead and read just the three next verses. So Matthew 27, verses 23 through 25. Starting at verse 23, it says, and the governor said, why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, his blood be on us and on our children. That's how confident they were of what they wanted. So now again, in verse 23, Pilate confirms his judgment that Jesus is innocent when he points out to the crowd, Jesus has committed no crime, because he says, what evil hath he done? Meaning, he doesn't know the answer to that question. He has no clue that Jesus has done anything evil, because Jesus has never done anything evil. And that question is a dual-purpose question. It also gives the crowd a response, an opportunity to bring forth any proof Jesus has committed a crime. Because he asks, what evil hath he done? Therefore, the answer would be this and this and this and this, these evil things. But instead of answering his question, they cry out even louder, let him be crucified. So first of all, those chants of let him be crucified should have been appalling to these Jewish people. Crucifixion was the Roman form of capital punishment, and it was abhorrent to most Jews. They hated crucifixion. And yet, here they are screaming out for Jesus to be crucified. And so you see, people were usually crucified completely naked. And the Jews were kind of an oddity in that period of time, because most of the world had been conquered by the Greeks, who believed nudity was the ultimate form of how to be. You should walk around naked as much as possible. I mean, they did their sports that way. They all went to saunas. And they had spread that throughout the known world. Yet the Jewish people, the religious ones, some had agreed with the Greeks. You remember we talked about Hellenists when we talked about the time between the New Testament and Old Testament, for those of us who were here. But the core religious Jews stuck to being clothed, completely clothed as much as possible. And so to think of a man being hoisted up in public, completely nude, would be abhorrent to them, that alone. It was also a long, torturous death, and the Jews viewed it as barbaric compared to stoning, which was the form of capital punishment that was ordained by God. So for them to be screaming, "Let him be crucified," it's really a remarkable thing that you could get the whole nation of people that were there for Passover screaming for a man to be crucified, because it went completely against everything they believed. So that shows you how much evil had been spread throughout those people in just a matter of days. And then secondly, we see a mob mentality here. Instead of rationally answering Pilate's call for evidence, they just start irrationally yelling out, crucify him, let him be crucified." And they just yell louder and louder. The facts no longer have any relevance in this proceeding. Pilate gives them an opportunity to bring up facts, and they have none. So they just start railing against Jesus. And they've given way to their emotions and the pressure from the Sanhedrin. It's kind of like everybody starts doing it, and so everybody kind of jumps in, right? It's like William and I went to a Stars game last night, and when they score, everybody stands up, everybody starts pumping their fists and yelling Dallas Stars, and nobody doesn't do it unless they're a fan of the other team that's sitting there. And it's that whole mentality of jumping in and being part of the group. So the Sanhedrin probably didn't even have to get everybody on board, just enough people that everyone else would be on board. And I can imagine that if social media had been present in those days, there would have been influencers filming and commenting on the will of the people instead of on the innocence of this man who's being accused. So we have the people here loudly chanting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate sees that no one is even listening to what he has to say anymore. It says he can't do anything about it. And so what does he do? He takes a bowl of water and washes his hands to illustrate that he refuses to be held accountable for the death of this innocent man. And the washing of hands is actually an old custom, and it's for that reason, to show that someone is not involved with something shameful or sinful. In fact, back in Deuteronomy 21, 6-7, you can actually read about God giving a hand-washing ritual to be used to testify that someone is innocent of a murder. And that was their way of testifying. They say, look, I'm going to wash my hands. I'm not part of this. And even today, we use that same expression, I wash my hands of it, and it's to deny involvement with anything. I'm done with this. It's gone farther than I want to go. I'm washing my hands. I'm going to be innocent of this. And so Pilate has made multiple attempts to free Jesus and to do it in a way that he won't lose face with the Sanhedrin or with Caesar. So now he attempts to just deny any involvement with Jesus' crucifixion. And he tells the Jews that they should just take care of it. So sadly for him, he can't be absolved of his part in killing Jesus. Even though he's washing his hands of it, he's still part of this terrible, horrible thing that's being done. And again, it is part of God's plan. It has to be done. But woe to the man that makes it happen. And then in verse 25, we see one of the most remarkable statements in this passage, when it says, "Then answered all the people and said, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" That's how badly they wanted it. These people who recently called Jesus Son of David and he that cometh in the name of the Lord are now willing to accept all responsibility for his crucifixion. And even after he has been pronounced innocent. Pilate has said, I find no fault in this man. What evil hath he done? Crucify him. Let him be crucified. And they're so sure that that's what they want that not only do they call upon his blood upon themselves, they call it upon their own children, condemning their own children to pay for this crucifixion. And then in Deuteronomy 19:10, it actually forbids the shedding of innocent blood within the promised land. And where is this taking place? Jerusalem, right? The heart of the promised land. Deuteronomy 19 says that innocent blood be not shed in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance, and so blood be upon thee. And so they're accepting that this passage in Deuteronomy may actually be in their minds. We accept the blood and on us and on our children. That's how sure they are that they are doing the right thing. Again, mob mentality, right? If everybody else thinks it's right, well, it must be right. You know, sometimes we're so blinded by our own desires, misconceptions, and preferences that we become cocky in our certainty that we're right, even when we're wrong. And we end up not only hurting ourselves spiritually, but we mislead others, often even our own families, because of our pride. And we mislead people into error. And that's what these people are doing, is it's just spreading error. It's spreading sin. So here, Pilate knows the right thing to do. When we read through this passage, we see he knows Jesus should be released. He's convinced of that. And he's seen it through many convincing means. Yet he chooses to do the wrong thing because he's falling subject to the multitudes. These people who are supposed to be subject to him as the governor, he's allowing them to determine what he does. Even though the people are screaming for Jesus to be crucified, he still had the power to set Jesus free. But now he can say, well, it was the will of the people, and go on with it. Pardon me a minute before we go to the next passage. I'm not sick anymore, but I'm still getting over some of the sickness. And so we're going to move on to verses 26 through 31. Hopefully you still have your Bibles open. So starting at verse 26, we see, Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall, and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him, and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him, and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him, and took the reed, and smote him on his head. And after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him, and put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. Imagine being Barabbas here. You know, I'm sure he thought he was going to the cross that day, because obviously they had already planned a crucifixion, because Jesus was placed between two criminals on the cross. There were two other guys being crucified that day. There were probably already, enough places for three guys, and Barabbas probably thought he was going to be in the middle of that. And now he's released, even though he's aware of his crimes. And this Jesus, who's innocent, is going to take his place on the cross at the same time as he takes all of our place on the cross. Think of that. This murdering, terrible person, Barabbas, who actually committed the crime that they say he did, Jesus takes his place on the cross as much as he does ours. So it's a beautiful picture that no matter how terrible a person you might think you are, Jesus still loves you and sacrificed himself for you. So the fact that people are willing to gamble their children's lives on Jesus' innocence seems enough to satisfy Pilate that he won't be held accountable. So he frees Barabbas, and then he has Jesus scourged and prepped for crucifixion. Now, scourging was whipping someone with a cat of 9 tails. And this was a short whip, and it had 9 strands. And each strand had small pieces of glass or sharp stones or metal or bone just knotted into the ends of it. And they would flail from the top of the convict's back down to close to their hips, and then do it again. And they would do it 39 times, because it was believed that if you did it 40 times, it would kill a man. And it would tear off ribbons of flesh in the process, and sometimes it would actually go to the skeleton. And the goal of scourging was to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse and death. Yet, it was not unusual for a criminal to die from the scourging alone, even before they made it to crucifixion. That's how terrible the scourging was. We read it, and it's a single word here where it says, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. We just see that word, scourged, but it's a terrible picture. In fact, in an article in the Journal of American Medical Association called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ, a doctor named William Edwards gives a detailed description of scourging. He says, scourging was a legal preliminary to every Roman execution, and only women and Roman senators or soldiers, except in the cases of desertion, were exempt. As the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions, and the leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissues. Then as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock. The extent of blood loss may well have determined how long the victim would survive the cross. The severe scourging with its intense pain and appreciable blood loss most probably left Jesus in a pre-shock state. Moreover, hematidrosis had rendered his skin particularly tender. The physical and mental abuse meted out by the Jews and the Romans, as well as the lack of food, water, and sleep, also contributed to his generally weakened state. Therefore, even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was at least serious and possibly even critical. That was all part of the crucifixion. When we think of Jesus dying for our sins, dying to pay the penalty for what we've done, we think of him being hoisted on the cross. We need to think back to the scourging and the beatings, because that was all part of the crucifixion. Isaiah tells us it's by his stripes we are healed. Those stripes are the scourging. Stripes are scars and cuts. Another remarkable thing about this process is that commonly the blows of scourging would lessen as the criminal confessed to his crimes. Yet Jesus remained silent because he had no crimes to confess. Therefore, the blows would have continued with full strength, all 39. Realize Jesus endured all of this humiliation of having the people he came to save deny him and cry out for his death in spite of his innocence, all because of his love for you. Jesus could have at any time escaped this. He had the power to do so, yet he didn't. That's how much he loves us. And he did it all without ever saying anything in his defense, all because of his love for you and me. And then in verse 27, it tells us the whole band or garrison of the governor's soldiers gathered around Jesus at this point. To crucify a single man, only 4 guards were required. Yet for Jesus, they bring out the whole garrison, which was typically 600 men. And they had probably accompanied Pilate from his main headquarters in Caesarea as his bodyguards. So these were Pilate's personal soldiers. And this may be in case he tries to escape, or in case his disciples come back and try to free him, or maybe they just all want in on torturing this man who has done so many mighty things. Imagine being some of these soldiers who have heard of the things that Jesus does. Now you've got him there and you've got power over him. So it could have been many, many things that may have caused them to bring the whole garrison here. Whatever the case, the cruelty of setting roughly 600 men against one man who's already been scourged, that's cruel. It's terrible. And now, after he's been scourged nearly to death, the Roman soldiers begin to mock and beat Jesus. Consider everything that has happened to Jesus in the last 24 hours. He was betrayed by one of his disciples. The other 11 abandoned him. Another disciple, one of his closest friends, has denied even knowing him. He was illegally tried by the hypocrites who should have instead recognized and honored his coming. The Jewish religious leaders. The people who had honored him less than a week ago are now clamoring for his crucifixion. And now he submits himself to this mockery and beating. All within the last 24 hours. That's why the doctor that wrote that mentions hunger, thirst, fatigue. Because you remember, he was tried all night. He hasn't slept. He hasn't eaten. He hasn't had anything to drink. Because it's been constant trials. And then David actually prophesied in Psalm 35 that Jesus would be treated this way. Psalm 35, 15 and 16 says, "But in mine adversity they rejoiced and gathered themselves together. Yea, the abjects gathered themselves together against me, and I knew it not. They did tear me and ceased not. With hypocritical mockers in feasts they gnashed upon me with their teeth." So they start by stripping him and putting a scarlet robe on him. Even removing his own robe would be cruel because it would be extremely painful, as it would tear off any coagulation and possibly even some of the loose flesh that was left from the scourging. I mean, I know how it is, like if I get a paper cut and I tear off the little bit of skin, that hurts. Imagine your whole back of loose flesh and they pull that robe off of him. And then they crown him with thorns and place a reed in his hand. The soldiers are sarcastically taking items meant for royalty and turning them into means of torture and mockery. And Isaiah prophesied this would happen in Isaiah 53:3, which says, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." And the word despised there can also be ridiculed. The scarlet robe was usually reserved for royalty, since scarlet cloth was more expensive because of the dyeing process. This was intended as a cruel mockery of Jesus' position as king. Because the Jews brought him and said, "He says he's the king of the Jews." So here, this scarlet robe becomes a means of torture. Because as we said, taking off the robe would tear off parts. Putting another one back on would have been painful as well. Because remember, they said he would have been especially tender from the loss of blood. And then the crown of thorns would have been twisted from local thorn bushes. And in that region, the thorns are long and hard. They're not like little rose thorns. We have rose bushes at our house, and I hate dealing with them because even getting one little prick of a little rose thorn in my finger hurts. And here they took long thorns from the local rose bushes, and they would have pushed it onto his head. They would have dug into his head. So this crown would have cut, pierced, and bloodied the head of the king who wore it. And then the reed they gave him sarcastically represented a scepter. Kings hold scepters, but those are glorious, ornate scepters that symbolize power. In their mockery of Jesus, the soldiers gave him a scepter, but it was a thin, weak reed. And then they continue to ridicule his position as king as they bow the knee before him, because kings are honored. You know, you bow before a king. Not here in the U.S. because we don't have kings, but in nations that have kings, when you appear before the king, you have to bow. If you watch anything with now it's a king in the UK. I was going to say the Queen. You'll see when people come into the room where he is, they will bow. And so these soldiers are bowing, but they're doing it, again, in mockery. They're doing it sarcastically. And then they proclaim as they bow, "Hail, King of the Jews." But again, they don't mean what they're saying, right? They're hypocritical. They're sarcastic about it. It's just meant to mock Jesus, to ridicule him. And it was meant to humiliate him using a royal title, but it also ridiculed the Jews, because it's like sarcastically asking the Jews, is this the best king you can bring forth? Look at what we've done to him. We've beaten him to a pulp. Is this your king? And then they shift from mockery to now cruelty. They start spitting on him, which again, he's been beaten, he's been scourged. The spit would sting. And then they take the rod that they've given him, they rob him of this symbol and grab it from his hands, and they start hitting him in the head. And in this word here includes the face. It's not just like hitting him on top of the head, like you do with one of those foam baseball bats when you're playing around with your siblings or something. But they would have been beating him in the face and head with this rod, this reed. And both Job and Micah prophesied that this would happen. Job 30, 8 through 10 says, "They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. And now am I their song, yea, I am their byword. They abhor me, they flee far from me, and spare not to spit in my face." And then Micah said in Micah 5:1, "Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek." And that's exactly what they're doing. Because that was one of the titles, one of the messianic titles was the judge of Israel. And they're taking the judge of Israel and they're beating him with a rod in the face. And all this was done in mockery of Jesus. Yet many times, we do the same thing today. We sometimes mock Jesus' position as king over us, when on Sunday we sing hymns and pronounce how great and wonderful he is, and then throughout the week, we live our own lives as if he had no leadership over us. Or no lordship over us. Sometimes I think we hurt Jesus more by the choices we make than these soldiers did when they mocked him and beat him, because we do it knowing full well he is the King and the Lord, when they were looking at him as a king and a Lord sarcastically. And yet, he endured all this for our sakes willingly, just as Isaiah prophesied he would in Isaiah 50, verse 6, that says, I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. Jesus did not turn away. Jesus did not try to escape any of this punishment. And then after they mock him, they take off the scarlet robe. Now, as with the original robe, removing this scarlet robe would probably, again, painfully tear off more coagulated blood and more loose pieces of flesh. And then they put his own robe back on him, and they lead him away to be crucified. Now, the march to the place of crucifixion was like advertising in Rome. It was marketing. It warned potential troublemakers that this was their fate should they challenge Rome. Should they break the capital laws, this is what would happen to them. So they would take the prisoner and march them on the longest route possible through the city. It was not a short route. And that would warn potential troublemakers. And normally you'd have a centurion on horseback that would lead the procession, and he would have a herald walking beside his horse that would be yelling out the crime of the condemned, so that everyone would know what this man has done, or in Jesus' case, not done, and they would know that this would be their fate. And then the condemned was led to the site of the crucifixion, and in a way that everyone would see that this man was about to be crucified. As Jesus was led away to be crucified, he was like most victims of crucifixion, forced to carry the wood that he would hang upon. Now, he wouldn't have carried the whole cross. Sometimes you see pictures of Jesus walking with a big cross on his shoulder. He would not have carried the whole cross. The uprights would already be on the hill, because the whole cross would be roughly 300 pounds to carry. And for a man that's been scourged, and in Jesus' case, beaten after the scourging, that wasn't a typical part of the crucifixion. That was something that they added because of Jesus' position. Now, the victim would only carry the crossbar, and that weighed anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds, which would be bad enough for someone in the state that a convict would be in. Now, when the victim carried the crossbar, he was usually stripped naked, and his hands would have been tied to the wood. So they would carry the crossbar across their neck, hands tied to the wood like this. And everyone knew that this cross was an unrelenting instrument of death, and only death. That's the only thing it means. If you're carrying that cross, that's your last day. That's like walking, the dead man walking when they're off to receive capital punishment. That's the end. And that may have been what Jesus had in mind when he said in Matthew 16:24, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. This would have been the scene Jesus had in mind, walking to death, because we are called to die to self. When we carry a cross, it's not like, a lot of times people say, oh, that's just my cross to bear. I have a brother-in-law that annoys me. I don't. But some people might say, oh, my brother-in-law or my sister-in-law really annoys me, and that's just my cross to bear. I can't do anything about it. Bearing a cross does not mean you can't do anything about it. Bearing a cross means dying. It means dying to self. When you allow the Holy Spirit to control your life, that's dying to self. When you choose not to do the things that your flesh wants to do because you know what's right before the Lord, that's dying to self. And that's what Jesus had in mind when he said that. It wasn't a glib thing when he said, take up your cross and follow me. The cross isn't about religious ceremonies. It's not about traditions. It's not about spiritual feelings. The cross was a way to execute people, and that's all it was. Taking up your cross is not a journey, it's a one-way trip. There's no return ticket. It's not round trip. It's death. And in our case, as Christians, death to self. And this is the picture Jesus was conveying when he said that. And then after he said that, he literally did it himself. He took up his cross, carried it to his own death for us. And since Jesus died for us, we should live for him. Chris, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer? Amen. Thank you.